Because of Winn-Dixie, Chapter 10, coming up next. Welcome back to Read with Maren, Because of Winn-Dixie, Chapter 10. If you recall last time, Opal was just about to tell Gloria Dump's whole life story after eating a delicious peanut butter sandwich. Let's begin. I told Gloria Dump everything. I told her how me and the preacher had just moved to Naomi and how I had to leave all my friends behind. I told her about my mama leaving, and I listed the 10 things that I knew about her. And I explained that here in Naomi, I missed Mama more than I ever had in Watley. I told her about the preacher being like a turtle, hiding all the time inside his shell. I told her about finding Winn-Dixie in the produce department and how, because of him, I became friends with Miss Franny Block and got a job working for a man named Otis at Gertrude's Pets, and I got invited to Sweetie Pie Thomas's birthday party. I even told Gloria Dump how Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry called her a witch. But I told her they were stupid, mean, bald-headed boys, and I didn't believe them. Not for long, anyhow. And the whole time I was talking, Gloria Dump was listening. She was nodding her head and smiling or frowning and saying, is that right? I could feel her listening with all her heart, and it felt good. You know what? She said when I was all done. What? Could be that you got more of your mama in you than just red hair and freckles and running fast. Really? I said. Like what? Like maybe you got her green thumb. 2 of us could plant something and see how it grows. Test your thumb out. Okay, I said. What Gloria Dump picked for me to grow was a tree, or she said it was a tree. To me, it looked more like just a plant. She had me dig a hole for it and put it in the ground and pat the dirt around it tight, like it was a baby, and I was tucking it in bed. What kind of tree is it? I asked. It's a wait-and-see tree. What does that mean? It means you got to wait for it to grow up before you know what it is. Can I come back and see it tomorrow? Child, as long as this is my garden, you're welcome in it. But that tree ain't going to have changed much by tomorrow. But I want to see you too, I said. I ain't going nowhere. I'll be right here. I woke Winn-Dixie up then. He had peanut butter in his whiskers and he kept yawning and stretching. He licked Gloria Dump's hand before we left, and I thanked her. That night when the preacher was tucking me into bed, I told him how I got a job at Gertrude's Pets, and I told him all about making friends with Miss Franny Block and getting invited to Sweetie Pie's party. And I told him about meeting Gloria Dump. Winn-Dixie lay on the floor waiting for the preacher to leave so he could hop up on the bed like he always did. When I was done talking, the preacher kissed me goodnight, and then he leaned way over and gave Winn-Dixie a kiss too, right on his head. You can go ahead and get up there now, he said to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie looked at the preacher. He didn't smile at him, but he opened his mouth wide like he was laughing, like the preacher had just told him the funniest joke in the world. And this is what amazed me most. The preacher laughed back. Winn-Dixie hopped on the bed and the preacher got up and turned out the light. I leaned over and kissed Winn-Dixie too, right on the nose, but he didn't notice. He was already asleep and snoring. Chapter 11. That night, there was a real bad thunderstorm. But what woke me up wasn't the thunder and lightning. It was Winn-Dixie whining and butting his head against my bedroom door. Winn-Dixie, I said, what are you doing? He didn't pay any attention to me. He just kept beating his head against the door and whining and whimpering. And when I got out of bed, I went over and put my hand on his head. He was shaking and trembling so hard it scared me. I knelt down and wrapped my arms around him, but he didn't turn around and look at me or smile or sneeze or wag his tail or do any normal kind of Winn-Dixie thing. He just kept beating his head against the door and crying and shaking. You want the door open? Huh? Is that what you want? I stood up and opened the door, and Winn-Dixie flew through it like something big and ugly and mean was chasing him. "Winn-Dixie!" I hissed. "Come back here!" I didn't want him going and waking the preacher up. But it was too late. Winn-Dixie was already at the other end of the trailer, in the preacher's room. I could tell because there was a spring sound that must have come from Winn-Dixie jumping up on the bed. And then there was a sound from the preacher like he was real surprised. But none of it lasted long because Winn-Dixie came tearing back out of the preacher's room, panting and running like crazy. I tried to grab him, but he was going too fast. "Opal," said the preacher. He was standing at the door to his bedroom, and his hair was all kinds of wild on top of his head, and he was looking around like he wasn't sure where he was. "Opal, what's going on?" "I don't know." But just then and there was a huge crack of thunder, one so loud that it shook the whole trailer, and Winn-Dixie came shooting back out of my room and running past me, and I screamed, "Daddy, watch out!" But the preacher was still confused. He just stood there, and Winn-Dixie came barreling right towards him like he was a bowling ball, and the preacher was the only pin left standing. And wham! They both fell to the ground. "Uh-oh," I said. "Opal," said the preacher. He was lying on top of his stomach, and Winn-Dixie was sitting on top of him, panting and whimpering. "Yes, sir," I said. "Opal." "Yes, sir," I said a little louder. "Do you know what a pathological fear is?" "No, sir." The preacher raised a hand. He rubbed his nose. "Well," he said after a minute, "it's a fear that goes way beyond normal fears. It's a fear you can't be talked out of or reasoned out of." Just then there was another crack of thunder, and Winn-Dixie rose straight up in the air like somebody had poked him with something hot. When he hit the floor, he started running. He ran back to my bedroom, and I didn't even try to catch him. I just got out of his way. The preacher lay there on the ground, rubbing his nose. Finally, he sat up. He said, "Opal, I believe Winn-Dixie has a pathological fear of thunderstorms." And just when he finished his sentence, here came Winn-Dixie again, running to save his life. I got the preacher up off the floor and out of the way just in time. There didn't seem to be a thing we could do for Winn-Dixie to make him feel better, so we just sat there and watched him run back and forth, all terrorized and panting. And every time there was another crack of thunder, Winn-Dixie acted all over again like it was surely the end of the world. "The storm won't last long," the preacher told me, "and when it's over, the real Winn-Dixie will come back." After a while, the storm did end. The rain stopped, and there wasn't any more lightning. Finally, the last rumble of thunder went away, and Winn-Dixie quit running back and forth and came over to where me and the preacher were sitting and cocked his head like he was saying, "What in the world are you two doing out of bed in the middle of the night?" And then he crept up on the couch with us in a funny way that he has, where he gets on the couch an inch at a time, kind of sliding himself into it, looking off in a different direction like it's all happening by accident. Like he didn't intend to get on the couch, but all of a sudden, there he is. And so the three of us just sat there. I rubbed Winn-Dixie's head and scratched him behind the ears the way he liked. And the preacher said, "There are an awful lot of thunderstorms in Florida in the summertime." "Yes, sir," I said. I was afraid that maybe he would say we couldn't keep a dog who went crazy with pathological fear every time there was a crack of thunder. "We'll have to keep an eye on him," the preacher said. He put his arm around Winn-Dixie. "We'll have to make sure he doesn't get out in a storm. He might try and run away. We have to make sure to keep him safe." "Yes, sir," I said again. And all of a sudden, it was hard for me to talk. I loved the preacher so much. I loved him because he loved Winn-Dixie. I loved him because he was going to forgive Winn-Dixie for being afraid. But most of all, I loved him for putting his arm around Winn-Dixie like that, like he was already trying to keep him safe. Chapter 12. Me and Winn-Dixie got to Gertrude's Pets so early for my first day of work that the closed sign was still in the window. But when I pushed on the door, it swung open, and so we went inside. I was about to call out to Otis that we were there, but then I heard music. It was the prettiest music I had ever heard in my life. I looked around to see where it was coming from, and that's when I noticed that all of the animals were out of their cages. There were rabbits and hamsters and gerbils and mice and birds and lizards and snakes, and they were all just sitting on the floor like they had turned to stone, and Otis was standing in the middle of them. He was playing a guitar, and he had on a skinny, pointy-toed cowboy boots, and he was tapping them while he was playing the music. His eyes were closed, and he was smiling. Winn-Dixie got a dreamy kind of look on his face. He smiled really hard at Otis, and then he sneezed, and then his whiskers went all fuzzy, and then he sighed and kind of dropped to the floor with the other animals. Just then, Gertrude caught sight of Winn-Dixie. "Dog!" she croaked and flew over and landed on his head. Otis looked up at me. He stopped playing his guitar, and the spell was broken. The rabbits started hopping, and the birds started flying, and the lizards started leaping, and the snakes started slithering, and Winn-Dixie started barking and chasing everything that was moving. And Otis shouted, "Help me!" For what seemed like a long time, me and Otis ran around trying to catch the mice and the gerbils and the hamsters and snakes and lizards. We kept on bumping into each other and tripping over animals, and Gertrude kept screaming, "Dog! Dog!" Every time I caught something, I put it back in the first cage I saw. I didn't care if it was the right cage or not. I just put it in and slammed the door. And the whole time I was chasing things, I was thinking that Otis must be some kind of snake charmer, the way he could play his guitar and make all of the animals turn to stone. And then I thought, this is silly. I shouted over Winn-Dixie barking and Gertrude yelling, and I said, "Play some more music, Otis." He looked at me for a minute, and then he started playing his guitar, and in just a few seconds, everything was quiet. Winn-Dixie was lying on the floor, blinking his eyes and smiling to himself and sneezing every now and then. And the mice and the gerbils and the rabbits, lizards and snakes that we hadn't caught yet got real quiet and sat still. And I picked them up one by one and put them all back in their cages. When I was done, Otis stopped playing. He looked down at his boots. "I was just playing him some music. It makes him happy." "Yes, sir," I said. "Did they escape from their cages?" "No. I take him out. I feel sorry for him being locked up all the time. I know what it's like, being locked up." "You do?" "I've been in jail," Otis said. He looked at me real quick and then looked back down at his boots. "You have?" "Never mind," said Otis. "Aren't you here to sweep the floor?" "Yes, sir," I told him. He walked over to the counter and started digging through a pile of things, and finally he came up with a broom. "Here," he said, "you should start sweeping." Only he must have gotten confused. He was holding out his guitar to me instead of the broom. "With your guitar?" I asked. He blushed and handed me the broom, and I started to work. I'm a good sweeper. I swept the whole store and then dusted some of the shelves. The whole time I worked, Winn-Dixie followed me and Gertrude followed him, flying behind him and sitting on his head and his back, croaking real quiet to herself, "Dog! Dog!" When I was done, Otis thanked me. I left Gertrude's Pets thinking about how the preacher probably wouldn't like it very much if I was working for a criminal. Sweetie Pie Thomas was waiting for me right out front. "I seen that," she said. She stood there and sucked on her knuckle and stared at me. "Seen what?" I said. "I seen all them animals out of their cages and keeping real still. Is that man magic?" "Kind of," I told her. She hugged Winn-Dixie around the neck. "Just like this grocery store dog, huh?" "Right," I said. I started walking, and Sweetie Pie took her knuckle out of her mouth and put her hand in mine. "Are you coming to my birthday party?" "I surely am." "The theme is pink." "I know it," I told her. "I gotta go," she said all of a sudden. "I gotta go home and tell my mama what I've seen. I live right down there in that yellow house. That's my mama on the porch. You see her? She's waving at you." I waved at the woman on the porch, and she waved back. I watched Sweetie Pie run off to tell her mama about Otis being a magic man. It made me think about my mama and how I wanted to tell her the story about Otis charming all the animals. I was collecting stories for her. I would also tell her about Miss Franny and the bear, and about meeting Gloria Dump and believing for just a minute that she was a witch. I had a feeling that these were the kind of stories my mama would like, the kind that would make her laugh out loud, the way the preacher said she loved to laugh. Chapter 13. Me and Winn-Dixie got into a daily routine where we would leave the trailer early in the morning and get down to Gertrude's Pets in time to hear Otis play his guitar music for the animals. Sometimes Sweetie Pie snuck in for the concert too. She sat on the floor and wrapped her arms around Winn-Dixie and rocked him back and forth until the music was over like a big old teddy bear. And she would walk around trying to pick out a pet that she wanted. But she always gave up and went home because the only thing she really wanted was a dog like Winn-Dixie. After she was gone, I would sweep and clean up and even arrange some of Otis's shelves because he did not have an eye for arranging things, and I did. And when I was done, Otis would write down my time in a notebook that he had marked on the outside. 1 red leather collar, 1 red leather leash. And the whole time, he did not in any way ever act like a criminal. After working at Gertrude's Pets, me and Winn-Dixie would go over to the Herman W. Block Memorial Library and talk to Miss Franny Block and listen to her tell us a story. But my favorite place to be that summer was in Gloria Dump's yard. And I figured it was Winn-Dixie's favorite place to be too, because when we got up to the last block before her house, Winn-Dixie would break away from my bike and start to run for all he was worth, heading for Gloria Dump's backyard and his spoonful of peanut butter. Sometimes Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry would follow me. They would holler, "There goes the preacher's daughter visiting the witch." "She's not a witch," I told them. It made me mad the way they wouldn't listen to me and kept on believing whatever they wanted to believe about Gloria Dump. One time, Stevie said to me, "My mama says you shouldn't be spending all your time cooped up in that pet shop and at that library, sitting around talking with old ladies. She said you should get out in the fresh air and play with kids your own age. That's what my mama says." "Oh, lay off her," Dunlap said to Stevie. Then he turned to me. "He didn't mean it," he said. But I was already mad. I shouted at Stevie. I said, "I don't care what your mama says. She's not my mama, so she can't tell me what to do." "I'm going to tell my mama you said that," shouted Stevie. "And she'll tell your daddy, and he'll shame you in front of the whole church. And that pet shop man is retarded, and he was just in jail, and I wonder if your daddy knows that." "Otis is not retarded," I said, "and my daddy knows he was in jail." That was a lie, but I didn't care. "And you can go ahead and tell on me if you want, you big bald-headed baby." I swear it about wore me out yelling at Dunlap and Steve Dewberry every day. By the time I got to Gloria Dump's yard, I felt like a soldier who had been fighting a hard battle. Gloria would make me a peanut butter sandwich straight off, and then she would pour me a cup of coffee with half coffee and half milk, and that would refresh me. "Why don't you play with them boys?" Gloria asked me. "Because they're ignorant," I told her. "They still think you're a witch, and it doesn't matter how many times I tell them you're not." "I think they're just trying to make friends with you in a roundabout way," Gloria said. "I don't want to be their friend." "It might be fun having them two boys for friends." "I'd rather talk with you," I said. "They're stupid and mean, and they're boys." Gloria would shake her head and sigh, and then she would ask me what was going on in the world and did I have any stories to tell her. And I always did. We're going to finish that today. Thank you so much for joining us. As you see, life isn't always easy. But remember, always look for the good in the world or make some yourself, just the way Opal does. Have a good time, and we'll see you next time. Why do I want to keep calling her Olive? We're going to try this one more time. He's going to say, because of Winn-Dixie, take 5. Go.
Because of Winn-Dixie, take 5.
Eating a delicious peanut butter salad sandwich, not a salad. Holy cramoly. Because of Winn-Dixie. I think you don't catch it. I'm like, maybe he's not going to catch this. And then you're like, bah! I'm like, shoot.